Good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Gavriluk, and I teach in the theology department here at the University of St. Thomas. I'm pleased to host today a panel on Russian-Ukrainian conflict and its international implications. As you know, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine began with the annexation of Crimea in March 2014 and shows little signs of abating, despite the peace plan signed in Minsk about a month ago. Before we begin our panel and before we introduce our distinguished speakers, please allow me to share with you a fragment from the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko's speech before the United States Congress. It seems to me that the question that Mr. Poroshenko raises is also of focal import for this panel.
Throughout the world are asking the same question. Are we on the eve of the new Cold War? Is the possibility of the new, terrible, unimaginable European war there? Is what until recently seemed unthinkable now becoming a reality? Sadly, today, the answer to all of these questions is yes. However, we cannot and must not accept this as an inevitability. As recently as in 2008, the President of Russia ran his election campaign under the slogan, "Freedom is better than non-freedom." And it was in Russia in the year 2008. And I am sure that despite the Crimean annexation and ongoing aggression, millions of Russians still remember that slogan and take it seriously. Please, let's remind them. Let's show them that the freedom is not the luxury, as some try to convince them, but necessity and the precondition for the true success of the nation. And I am convinced that the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia have enough goodwill to give a peace one last chance and prevail against the spirit of hate between our countries.
So our distinguished speakers will help us understand the conflict by placing it in a larger historical and social context. The format of today's discussion will be as follows. Each of the four panelists will have 15 minutes to make an opening statement. Now, if you wish to ask a question, please use the index cards that were supplied in front of the auditorium. And of course, if you do not have an index card, we will help you to pick one up. After the opening statements, I will invite our panelists to comment on each other's presentations if they so desire. And it's at this point that we will be collecting your questions on the index cards and forwarding them to the speakers. We should then have approximately 45 questions for the Q&A session. Now, I should add that our panel today is being co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, the Political Science Department, of which we have two distinguished representatives today, and also Minnesota International Center and the Aquinas Chair. Now, our first speaker is Dr. Steve Hoffman, who is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science here at the University of St. Thomas. Professor Hoffman has published numerous books, journal articles, and technical reports in the areas of energy and environmental policy, as well as issues of national identity in the post-Soviet states of Belarus and Lithuania. He has presented at numerous international conferences, most recently at the Faculty of International Relations, Belarusian State University, Minsk, Belarus, and the College of Engineering at the University of Reading, United Kingdom. In addition to his academic work, Professor Hoffman has served as a director for a number of local and statewide environmental organizations, including Friends of the Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness, and then also Minnesotans for an Energy-Efficient Economy, which is now Fresh Energy, and also the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs and the Clean Water Action in Minnesota. Now, Professor Hoffman is going to speak about the Russian president's ambitions in Ukraine and the propaganda machine that serves them. Also, the complexities of national identity in Ukraine and how these complexities are reflected in the present-day conflict. Please welcome Professor Hoffman.
If you'd like, I could talk about paddling up in the boundary waters. If you'd. All righty, always off to a good start. I see a couple of my students out in the audience. I've told them to keep track, and if I make any mistakes, they can interrupt. But I do remember that I give them their final grade. So, thank you all for being here tonight. The panel tonight is going to talk about this issue through a variety of lenses, talking about strategic interest, NATO enlargement, economic imperatives, and so on. What I want to talk about is something slightly different, which is the question of identity. You could put it in a rather crude way by asking the question of who is a real Russian, just like you can ask the question of who's a real American, who is a real Ukrainian, who is a real Lithuanian, who is a real Belarusian. And importantly, what are the consequences of understanding that question in particular ways? I want to begin with a quote that my colleague Dr. Kemp gave me the other day, which is from a film, Karpati, 50 Miles, 50 Years. And I would draw your attention to the statement by the central character of that film, who says that he had his bris in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, his bar mitzvah in Czechoslovakia, his divorce in the Soviet Union, and he assumes that he is going to be buried in Ukraine. But he never left his hometown, except maybe for 50 miles. So the question is just, what is Mr. Gottinger? Is he a Czech, former Czech? Is he a former Ukrainian? Is he a former Russian? Or is he a Ukrainian today? I'm sure that if you ask him, he would have the answer to the question. If you ask me, I don't know. I don't know what he would be. But he, of course, is not the only one thinking about identity. The theme of identity technology works until it doesn't. Is it moving? It's not moving on the screen. Okay. Check back. Okay. Anyway, I would call your attention to the words of President Putin in his speech to the Duma and to the world celebrating Crimea's decision to join Russia. As you can see by this quote, he calls attention to a set of shared cultural touchstones that move from the most ancient symbols of Russia to relative being a relative term, relatively contemporary references to what we thought was a very long-dead empire that, in Mr. Putin's telling, justifies his recent actions in regard to the newest part of Russia. What's important about Mr. Putin's thinking, among many other things, of course, is that for him, a significant element of one's Russian identity centers around language. This, of course, is a very contested claim, but despite the fact that it's contested, Mr. Putin is insistent, returning again and again to the idea that language, more than any other what sociologists would refer to as a primordial asset, language defines who one is. As a result, a violation of language rights in any form is a violation of a person's right to express his or her essential humanity. In this case, the the freedom to be and act as a real Russian. For Mr. Putin, the usurpation of this right to be Russian is evident in the new Ukraine. He hopes for something peaceful, but as he pointed out again in his speech, this is not how the situation developed. Time and again, he said, attempts were made to deprive Russians of their historical memory, even of their language, again, the importance of language, and to subject them to forced assimilation. Again, note here the emphasis on language and its critical role in defining who one is, and most importantly, how the failure to accommodate that language amounts to a legitimate grievance that must be corrected in one way or another. Mr. Putin continues this line of thinking with an ambiguous threat, again basing his threat on the perceived injustices being brought to bear upon fellow Russians in Ukraine and elsewhere. And what does he do? He conflates Russian speakers with, quote, real Russians who must be defended. Of course, this is an old historical argument, but the issue of national identity is a very dynamic one as well. And we're seeing that again today in Russia and elsewhere, particularly with respect to this notion of Eurasianism, which is an ideological notion that first arose amongst Russian philosophers and historians who migrated from communist Russia to Western Europe in the 1920s. According to one scholar, these folks link the Russian people to the Turkic-speaking peoples of the Central Asian steppe and the ancient Persians of Iran, thus the idea of Turanians. The Eurasian has placed great emphasis on traditional Turanian social structures and, most importantly, the religious identities of these people, and which in Russia's case, of course, means Eastern Orthodoxy. As if you've, of course, paid attention to the news over the last year, few months anyway, Mr. Putin has elevated Orthodoxy, and he uses the trappings of the church to bolster the legitimacy of his actions, which is a tactic that's very easily located within a more immediate and pragmatic set of actions, including the establishment of the Eurasian Economic Community. What's important about this, of course, is that the idea that Ukraine would reject this EEC in favor of deeper ties with the West does two things. It's an ideological affront to the Eurasianists, right? And that apparently form an important part of the Kremlin's decision-making apparatus. And it's a blow to the pragmatists, including Mr. Putin, who place great stock in the community's ability to serve as an economic counterweight to the European Union. For a lot of folks, of course, this whole idea is kind of suspect at best and contrived and not very sensible at worst. But the fact is that nation building and the successive efforts at state building are generally affairs that are replete with the constructions referred to by Ernest Gellner, the imaginings that are at the heart of Benedict Anderson's thinking, and the process of forgetting that Ernst Renan insists upon if nation builders are to succeed in their efforts. All of these things are, of course, on display in Ukraine as well. About 100 years ago, we all know, World War I started. And there's one battle in particular that I want to draw your attention to that took place between April 29th and May 3rd, 1915. You can see how a New York Times reporter recently described this battle. I would draw your attention again to the very last sentence in this quote that says, "Makivka showed that we could fight." The question, of course, is exactly who is the we that is being referred to here? The soldiers who fought at Makivka were doing so under the banner of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. In addition to the 800 or so soldiers that fought at this battle, an additional 250,000 Ukrainians served the Austrians as conscripts. 3.5 million others served the Russian Empire. Vast majority of those were conscripts, of course. A fact that reflects Europe pre-World War I. The West being under the control of, speaking in very general terms, a fairly liberal regime that was content to let the Ukrainian nationalists that were beginning to bubble up have at least some freedom to do what they would. The East, governed by the Russian Empire, very illiberal and very intent upon ensuring that no independent sense of Ukrainianism, that is an identity of Ukrainianism, ever emerged. Again, speaking in very general terms, World War I managed to produce a series of competing Ukrainian states located in various parts of that space. These were very short-lived experiments, but nonetheless, in the eyes of many Ukrainian nationalists, this very brief period of autonomy, even if it didn't result in the ability of these states to exercise the powers associated with a sovereign place, was crucial for the development of the idea of a unique Ukrainian national identity, and ultimately the parallel development of a sovereign Ukraine. During this period immediately after World War I, there was a great deal of effort put into developing this sense of Ukrainian nationalism. Post-war actions did very little to bring these dreams to fruition. 20, 30 years later, there was another great period of unrest rooted in the nationalist struggle, which occurred again in the context of another world war and its aftermath, a major element of which involved the conflict in the West between Polish and Ukrainian nationalists. If you're interested in reading about this, I'd refer you to Timothy Snyder's book on the Reconstruction of Nations. What's important about Snyder's work is that he exhaustively traces the bloody history of a little-known conflict between Ukrainian and Polish nationals, giving equal time to the atrocities committed by both sides of the equation. The result, all of this, of course, produced borders that were constantly in flux, constantly changing, and ultimately these borders. And what were these states about? Quoting from a Polish officer when asked about the rights of certain minorities in the west of Ukraine and the east of Poland, he says that having reached an understanding with the Soviet Union, what we ended up with was a couple of national states rather than a couple of states of nations. The consolidation of those ethnic forces, or at least those nationalist forces that were so active earlier in the century. The question that this brings up, of course, is this big one. Okay? Has the last century of nation building resulted in a coherent, cohesive nation state in Ukraine? I point out that this is not a unique question. This is not a unique Ukrainian question. It's a question that is all over this region of the world. Dr. Burr and I, for instance, have done done a good deal of work with folks over in both Belarus and Lithuania, asking the question about national identity in those places, and in particular, whether the generation of youth that has now grown up in the context of an independent Belarus and an independent Lithuania, to what extent have they taken on the markers of national identity? Do they perceive themselves, do they characterize, have they internalized this notion of being Belarusian, being Lithuanian? And the answer is mixed in this case. The answer is very mixed. If you really want to go through these numbers, we could go through all these numbers. Clearly, I don't have enough time to do that. But if you would go through we did some surveys of several hundred youth at both Belarusian State University and Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas, Lithuania, and we asked them all kinds of questions about this issue. And the answer was, sort of. Right? There is some sense, again, reflected in these tables that I am going to pass through, okay, that the youth of those countries, having grown up in an independent Ukraine, or independent Belarus, independent Lithuania, have taken on the characteristics of dedicated nationalist, but only to some extent. There is, particularly in the case of Belarus, a high degree of ambiguity about this issue. Now, we haven't done that same work in the case of Ukraine, but we can turn to other polling data to ask the question of, is there an essential integrity in public opinion? Is there an evolving national opinion? We've heard much about the split between East and West, and in a Gallup poll taken in March of 2014, which, as we know, much has happened in the world since March of 2014, so we would have to be somewhat cautious in accepting the argument that these data reflect current conditions. But I think it's fair to say that they probably, the numbers might have moved in one direction or another, but they would probably still reflect this kind of split, reflect a deeply divided country, one where a national consensus is hard to find over any number of issues. For instance, if you look here, in terms of the Russian Federation's decision to send in troops, well, what do you notice? If you notice the numbers, the split between East and West, obviously there's a split. If you ask about a number of other issues, such as whether to join a union that's focused on the West versus one on the East, big differences between East and West. Again, you just go through the numbers and you see that in answer to the question, has there emerged a national consensus, a national body of opinion that transcends historic divisions between East and West? At least in these data, it's hard to find that kind of consensus. However, let's flip forward one more, I think. Two more. This is, to me, a really very interesting finding. You'll remember, of course, that President Putin is insistent that language is primordially essential, that that is the way we define who we are, at least in his mind, and that the threat to that language justifies all kinds of actions, including, apparently, military intervention. When asked, are Russian speakers under threat? Mr. Putin's, the victims that Mr. Putin identifies apparently don't agree with his assertion that they are under threat. Now again, this is March 2014, so a lot has happened. We might get some different answers. But I think it's telling that if there's one thing around which there's a national consensus, at least a higher level of agreement, this seems to be the one thing. So, there's a lot of hard choices facing Ukraine and its people and its leaders. This is really not a surprise. Historically, Ukraine has always been a borderland, not just between empires, but between worldviews. It's always been that point of flux, always that point of contention. Whether to turn east or to turn west, it remains a decision that's mediated by struggles over identity, as well as the practical politics of a region that continues to be unsettled by centuries-long historical trends and actions taken by those whose sense of self, both personal and national, are deeply informed by those competing visions of the past. Whether the nation-building efforts of the last 100 years or so will serve as a sufficient bulwark against the disintegration of contemporary Ukraine is no doubt the most pressing challenge that is faced by both the country's leaders and those who choose to call themselves Ukrainian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hoffman. Well, it's crucial to understand the issues of identity in order to come to grips with how the crisis was created to start with. Our second speaker is Professor Renee Burr. who is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of International Studies here at the University of St. Thomas. Professor Burr's research interests include nationalism and the impact of European Union integration on national identity and political party performance. She has published papers in these areas in such journals as Government and Opposition, Nationalities Papers, and the Journal of Baltic Studies. She is also a co-editor of a monograph on Belarusian and Lithuanian national identity published by the Vytautas Magnus University Press. Professor Burr is going to speak on the topic of Ukraine and the European Union, 2 decades of indecision. Please welcome Professor Burr.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to speak, Paul. And it's really great to see a number of my students out there, so I will do a shout out to my students as well and the Foreign Affairs Club representing. Wonderful. So because this is such a multifaceted problem, Dr. Hoffman and I decided to try to divide this up in some sort of logical way where we could take one chunk versus another chunk of the story here. So what I decided to focus upon is the European Union and its relationship with Ukraine. The reason why we want to understand that relationship is it's quite a tense relationship. Much more complicated, much more indecisive than the images of the Euromaidan might lead us to believe. So the Maidan protests in many, especially many Western media, are referred to as the Euromaidan, and there's this equation of the Maidan protests with the desire for the Ukrainian people to join the European Union. And that certainly was one part of what the Euromaidan was about, but the relationship between the EU and Ukraine is actually quite complicated and has been relatively, I don't want to use the term troubled, but not as embracing as it could have been. Of course, my technology is not working, so I will just kind of walk you through it. But the title that I chose, The European Union and Ukraine, 2 Decades of Indecision, is much more I would say the indecision and the fault for the indecision is more on the head of the European Union and its decision-making throughout the past few years, well, since 1994. So we'll see if we can get this going, and if not, I'll just flip to the next slide and talk you through it. Woohoo! All right. Wonderful. So we have to begin with what is always referred to in the literature as Ukraine's European choice. So in the early post-Soviet period, the question of whether to turn to the west or turn to the east was a pretty significant question, especially in terms of the type of foreign policy that a state was going to adopt. Some states were very unambiguous about their turn westward. So the return to Europe for the Baltics was particularly important. In the case of Ukraine, their choice to embrace Europe was perhaps a bit surprising. We were not at all surprised to see the Baltics turning in that direction. But with Ukraine, it was a much more ambiguous situation, and their initial choice to say we will engage with Europe was an initial first step in that relationship. So Ukraine was actually, along with the Baltic states, one of the first states to pursue some sort of economic integration with the European Union, and quite enthusiastically. What is particularly interesting is in 1994, that's when the concrete actions towards European integration begin, both for Ukraine and for the Baltics. And this happens under the Kuchma administration. So someone who we don't usually think of as a very, very pro-Western presidential figure, but from 1994 to 2004, he negotiated a number of agreements with the European Union, and almost all the substantial efforts towards integration happened under his regime. And Ukraine not only was interested in engaging for themselves with the EU, they believed in acting as a conduit for other states. So the relationship between Belarus and the EU was very strained, very difficult. And so Ukraine offered themselves as a sort of intermediary. So this demonstrates a very significant commitment early on to European integration. That being said, the European choice in Ukraine was different than it was in the Baltics. In the Baltics, the European choice was an either-or kind of choice. So if you were going to integrate with Europe, you were rejecting Russia. And this really has to do with the nationalist political parties of the time and the feeling that the greatest threat to sovereignty of the new post-Soviet states was the high level of dependency on Russia. So we have the Baltic approach, which is completely turning west, which was extremely painful and very difficult to accomplish because the dependency upon Russia was the same for the Baltics as it was for Ukraine. Ukraine adopts a different approach that is referred to in the literature as a multivectoral policy. So the notion that one could integrate with the European Union and maintain a high level of engagement with Russia, and that these two things were in no way contradictory, that you could move in both directions simultaneously. So the Ukrainian-European choice was not an either-or choice between the European Union and Russia. It was a choice to engage both sides. And what Dr. Hoffman and I have found in a recent paper that we have been working on is that the dynamics he talks about with there's a lot of economic division in the country, factor endowment differences on either side of the geographic divide. There's a great deal of identity difference. So this multivectoral policy is actually a very pragmatic way of dealing with what may be division that is pretty difficult for the average politician to try to overcome. So just to walk quickly through a timeline of EU-Ukrainian interactions, what we find here, and you'll find the common theme of all of these, is that Ukraine is approaching the European Union and apparently far more interested in a deeper relationship with the European Union than the European Union is putting on offer. So if we look at the sequence of events, we start with the TASIS program, which was an assistance program. It was to any post-Soviet state that felt that it needed the assistance. And this was really just an initial aid program intended to promote some democratic reforms and some market reforms. It did not amount to any sort of initial step towards integration. It was really just an aid kind of relationship. The first step towards integration is the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, the PCA of 1994. And I'll talk a bit about the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement in a moment. But this is where we start the sequence of interactions between the EU and Ukraine towards some eventual form of economic integration. We have the European Neighborhood Policy that appears in 2004. I will discuss that a bit, but again, this is a policy that is really aimed towards post-Soviet states, very ambiguous as to whether there was any sort of future for actual integration of Ukraine as a member state into the EU. And Ukraine was really treated very similarly to other former Soviet states other than the Baltics, which were treated in a very different way. And we have the Association Agreement in 2014, the most recent movement on that. So the EU essentially moves once every 10 years on this process. So not exactly a quick process of integration. To compare, the Baltics began their integration efforts in 1994 and were full-fledged members by 2004. So much faster schedule. So the PCA, as I mentioned, was signed under President Kuchma. And Kuchma is known for his economic reforms, not his political reforms. He has a reputation of certainly maintaining the multivectoral policy, believing in the multivectoral policy, but we tend to think of him as relatively pro-Russia. And so this engagement with the EU and the fact that almost all the substantive efforts happened under his watch is interesting. The objectives of the PCA were really just a sort of free trade area sort of goal. So the notion that Ukraine would be able to trade with the European Union in a way similar to, for example, the Maghreb countries of North Africa. So it was that sort of a relationship. The idea is really to usher former Soviet states into lining up with the expectations of the World Trade Organization and allowing for some access to the European market. So when we talk about integration in the European context, the question is, how deep is that integration? And this integration is not particularly deep. It was actually much more geared towards WTO compliance. And the big challenge for the EU-Ukraine relationship is the lack of a membership perspective. This is just a term that the European Union uses that says, at some point we may offer you membership. So a membership perspective usually sets up some sort of a timeline, usually sets up a set of requirements for what is necessary for that state to become a member. Ukraine has never been offered a membership perspective. So for a state that engaged early with the EU and has demonstrated a high level of interest in economic cooperation with the EU, the lack of a membership perspective is a bit puzzling and is a problem for their relationship. The biggest problem is that if there's no membership perspective, there is no great carrot or stick. So all of these changes that the EU wants future member states to make are difficult, they're painful, politically they're painful, economically they're painful. There has to be some great reward at the end to really inspire those changes. And without a membership perspective, and with this ambiguous idea of what the end point was in this relationship, there was very little incentive to make all of the very painful choices politically and economically that you would need to make in order to enter into the European Union. The ENP is negotiated in 2004. A lot of you are probably thinking, well, 2004, Orange Revolution. Well, all of this was negotiated before the Orange Revolution. So the last bit of negotiations wrapped up prior to the events of the Orange Revolution. And so there were a number of differences between the PCA and the ENP. The ENP did call for a higher level of integration. It called for the creation of action plans that had specific requirements for what a state would have to do and set goals, and then the EU would be responsible for monitoring the achievement of those goals. So in terms of integration, this is a good step forward. It incentivizes some actual change and gives the state involved a much clearer idea of what is expected of them. So that was a big change from the PCA. That being said, we're still talking about no membership perspective. So now they've got a longer list of tasks, a much clearer list of tasks, and EU monitoring to make sure that they're achieving those tasks, but without the ultimate goal of potential membership. The action plan was negotiated between the EU and Ukraine, and it called for some specific reform measures. So the Orange Revolution takes place, and I think understandably so, the Yushchenko administration assumes that if the Ukrainian people came out, fought for democracy, fought for what he called European parliamentarism, that the EU should provide some sort of increased incentive in exchange for that. So, unfortunately, with the Orange Revolution happening after the negotiations, the European Union proved unwilling to consider reopening negotiations on any of the agreements. So the Yushchenko administration inherited the ENP from the previous administration. And Yushchenko's administration was taking a hard turn westward. So when we're thinking of this multivectoral policy, he was actually departing from it and moving in a pretty westward direction. Made that very clear, indicated that he wanted to open membership talks for the European Union within 3 years of his election. And he really genuinely believed that the Orange Revolution provided the democratic credentials that would make Ukraine a viable future member of the European Union. And there is a level of frustration that arrives around this time period where it's very obvious the Baltic states are already well through the process of accession into the European Union. They become member states in 2004. Bulgaria and Romania, which had been, for lack of a better term, the laggards of the area, were integrated in 2007. So Ukraine starts early in this process, but is still very, very far from any sort of attempt at membership. And so when we compare the types of documents that were established between Ukraine and the EU to those documents that were established between the accession states, especially the Baltic states and former satellites, we can look at the Copenhagen criteria. And these criteria gave very clear dictates on political and economic changes that needed to be made. This included an insane amount of European Union law that they had to comply with. They had advisors from the European Union, they had money from the European Union, they came in, they told them how to do it, when to do it, and they helped them pay for it. Ukraine was never given that level of assistance. And what we often see in the EU-Ukraine relationship is this idea that these are Ukraine's problems. They are not the EU's problems to solve, they are Ukraine's problems to solve. And so the EU insisted that someday they may offer a membership perspective, but that Ukraine had to make progress in a large number of objectives before even the notion of a membership perspective would be extended. So some of the basic categories that the EU expected progress on were the level of democracy, proper respect for the rule of law, working with the electoral system, make sure that it has as few flaws as possible, and a lot of economic changes, specifically dealing with modernization and with anti-corruption efforts. And the idea that these were Ukraine's problems, and when Ukraine fixed them, the EU would consider membership, but before that time, this would not be a viable option. So why such a lukewarm approach? I was hoping to pull up the Eurobarometer, but I'm not even going to try to destroy this little computer setup we have here. So the Eurobarometer is this wonderful survey instrument that gives us an idea of how the publics in different countries think about major issues of the European Union. And of course, there is a wonderful question that says, do you think membership should be extended to Ukraine? And what we find is this huge gap between the powerful states, who, for one reason or another, don't want to extend that membership. So in Germany and France in particular, Germany is worried about the budget and about what enlargement means for the budget. France is worried about offending Russia and how that may cause trouble. And so the idea of letting Ukraine into the EU is extremely unpopular in these two most powerful countries. On the other hand, Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, the states that are closer, have more trade ties, are very enthusiastic about trying to bring Ukraine in. And so you have this contest between the old school powerful EU states and the new members who are trying to keep their neighbors within their sphere, trying to maintain those trade ties. And there's this real fear that this curtain will drop, right? It's a new curtain. It's not the Iron Curtain, it's the EU trade curtain, and that this will cut off Ukraine from all of its traditional ties with its neighbors. Oh, I'm sorry. 20. Okay. All right. So finally, with Ukrainian public opinion, Dr. Hoffman touched on that a bit. It also tends to be a bit lukewarm. In the West, it's much less ambiguously pro-EU. In the East, I would be reluctant to say pro-Russian, sort of, somewhat pro-Russian. And so that division is pretty substantial. And even in the West, where they're pretty pro-EU, there is a sense of disillusionment with the glacial pace that the European Union has taken with integrating Ukraine into this system. So, I will skip the association agreement. You can definitely find it online. It's on Europa. Okay. So Paul asked us to try to address a little bit what this means, what the instability means for the European Union in this case. And what can we say? There's definitely concern about the regional instability. The EU is not really known for wanting to intervene militarily. Very likely that they would turn to NATO, and I will defer on that to my colleague Tom. And so there's this sort of selective engagement that, yes, we have to worry about Ukraine, but are we actually willing to engage in some sort of security operation? That's much more questionable. And the one thing we might be able to say is, given the glacial pace of this relationship, this may have given the EU a reason to engage a little bit more quickly, a little bit more vigorously with Ukraine. But that's about as much as we can say for where the EU sits right now on this issue. So I will wrap up with that, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Burr. I think it's important to understand the different scenarios of Euro integration to understand what precisely is at stake for Ukraine's future. Let me just a quick reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please use the cards that you will find outside of the auditorium, and we'll collect the cards after the opening statements. Our third speaker is Professor Will Jacobs, who is Professor Emeritus of History and Political Science in the University of Alaska, Anchorage, where he taught modern European history, international relations, and the history of warfare. He also served in a variety of administrative posts, including that of an associate provost of his university. His principal research interest is the changing relationship between state power, national strategy, and the capacity to wage war since 1914. His published research has focused on American and British tactical and strategic air operations in the Second World War. Professor Jacobs will be addressing the following questions. First, what is the crisis in Ukraine? Precisely what does the crisis spring from, and why does it matter? Focusing specifically on the last question. Please welcome Professor Jacobs.
I can say that having lived and worked in Alaska for 40 years, I do bring one rather interesting perspective. When the Iron Curtain came down and Russian visitors came to our house and to my wife's employment in the Anchorage Museum with some regularity, 90% of them informed us that Russia had never actually sold Alaska. That it had in fact leased it, and the lease was about to expire. This was repeated with some force. I'd like briefly to address 4 propositions from the perspective of an historian of modern Europe and an historian of modern warfare. The first is what my wife would sometimes call the bleeding obvious, which is that Ukraine is in the midst of a compound crisis of governance, insurrection, and invasion, war, that threatens its existence as an independent sovereign state. Some of this is owing to domestic Ukrainian sources, a crisis of legitimacy that proceeds from a brutal past, a contested history, and 2 decades of less than good government. Thirdly, that said, the scale of this crisis and the threat that it poses to Ukraine's independence and to the interests of Europe and the United States is the result of war. It is the result of decisions taken by Vladimir Putin's government to attack Ukraine. And finally, that war has put to an end what we commonly referred to as the European post-Cold War international order. That is over. For Europe and the United States, the question now arises, what is to be done? And when I get to that part of my talk, I will pass the baton to Tom. First, with respect to Ukraine. Ukraine is a young state, one of the successor states of the Soviet Union, or if you like, of the Soviet Empire. It is a weak state, the result of more than 2 decades of less than good governance. It suffers from weak and compromised state institutions, and from the perspective of my expertise, these have to do with security and the armed forces. Its politics have been dominated by oligarchs, indeed sometimes described as a balancing act amongst oligarchs, some of whom can be called klepto-oligarchs. It has suffered from deep corruption over the entirety of its history as an independent state, but I dare say that the recently departed and unlamented Yanukovych set the new standard. It is estimated by some that he and the people around him siphoned off the better part of $100 billion for their own private uses. Ukraine has a nightmarish history. It's not the only state to have suffered a nightmarish history, but Ukraine's is probably, it can be fairly said, is almost uniquely bad. It is the center of what the very well-known Yale historian Timothy Snyder has called the Bloodlands, a space in which mass killing, Stalinist-enforced famine, Stalinist terror, Nazi murder, Nazi-imposed famine, large-scale war, and ethnic cleansing were operated to their fullness between 1933 and 1946 or 47. What this means is that in Ukrainian life there are plenty of villains. You can choose on any given day between Germans, Russians, Poles, Austrians, and fellow Ukrainians. To say that this makes political life difficult, to say that this makes the achievement of the kind of consensus that Professor Hoffman was referring to makes that difficult is, I think, a considerable understatement. It has significant cultural divisions, but again, it's not unusual in this respect. Other states have been ruled by a variety of empires. This has not essentially fundamentally compromised its existence as, or their existence as an independent state. It has a weak economy, about to get weaker. There's a looming crisis in the funding of its sovereign debt. If that were not enough, there's a distinct possibility that Putin will renew the war, which is currently in a state of semi-ceasefire, to gain control of the Black Sea coast, to supply his newly annexed Crimea. And finally, if that weren't enough, winter is coming, with all that means for ordinary Ukrainians. Now, those things said, Russian intervention in Ukraine is not new in the post-Soviet world. For much of the period right up until the beginning of the current crisis in early 2014, there's been a very active program of penetrating the security services and the armed forces of Ukraine by the various Russian security and intelligence services. Indeed, I think I once remarked in a conversation recently that if the government of Ukraine were to pay really close attention to what is necessary to achieve or to maintain its independence, it would be very good if it could find a Felix Dzerzhinsky, someone essentially to gain control over and enforce obedience in the Ukrainian security services. Secondly, and there have been many other sort of political interventions by one device or another, but many of you are familiar with the history of manipulating gas prices, gas supply and gas prices. And finally, of course, the events that essentially sponsored or prompted the Euromaidan, the essential intervention to prevent the signing of the EU association agreement. This intervention escalated very rapidly after the flight of Yanukovych. It led directly to the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of that territory to the Russian Federation. Lest anyone be sort of tempted to slide around this, that is an act of war. It established, in effect, a state of war between Russia and the Ukraine. The insurrection in eastern Ukraine probably began from domestic sources, although there's an argument about that, but it very quickly received material support, arms, ammunition, and volunteers for that insurrection directly from Russia. Russia provided special forces and weapons. And in August of this year, most recently, when the separatists looked to be losing ground, looked to be in rather desperate condition, Putin ordered regular forces to invade to rescue them. That was the background to the so-called ceasefire. It's really a semi-ceasefire because fighting continues at very low levels. Despite that ceasefire, some observers, the most recent of which is the economist reporter Tim Judah in an article that appeared today in the New York Review of Books, the thing that some observers do in fact fear that very soon Putin will renew military activity aimed at securing communication between the present territory of the Russian Federation and the newly annexed territory of Crimea. In short, to gain control of the Black Sea coast. Now, what does this mean for what we have called the post-Cold War European order? In my view, the Russian attack on Ukraine has effectively put an end to that. That order was commonly described in the early years of the post-Soviet period as Europe free, whole, and at peace. That formula can be found in many, many, many venues. Much was hoped even expected from a Europe that now could be defined as existing from the Atlantic to the Urals. A Europe no longer politically, economically, and culturally divided. At the center of these aspirations was the hope that the Russian Federation could be brought into the network of multilateral institutions that had grown up in Europe and globally in the post-World War II period. There was abroad in the United States and in Western Europe and in other places the so-called Kantian hope, after a great piece written by Immanuel Kant in the 1790s, that some combination of republican representative government and commerce would usher in a long period of stable government and peace. The principal embodiment of that, and I will read you two very short sections. Principal embodiment of that hope was in the so-called Budapest Memorandum, 1994. A document signed by Ukraine, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States on the occasion of Ukraine's surrender of its nuclear weapons. Article 1. The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, this is Helsinki, 1975, to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America reaffirm their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and that none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Those principles are now, in my view, overthrown. They have become what the German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg described when the provisions of the Belgian Neutrality Treaty were brought to him, or when he was reminded of them. He described them as a scrap of paper. Now, much of the hopes, if you will, were unreasonable, owing to problems that could be seen at the time. Problems such as the governance of the successor states, the huge human costs involved in the transition to post-Soviet economies, from command to market economies, the inherent weakness of multilateral institutions, which are heavily dependent on self-limiting good behavior by member states, and, of course, the possibility of a revanchist Russian government resentful of geopolitical defeat. These problems and the fears associated with them have now been fully realized in Putinism, which I think can be described fairly as a toxic combination of brutal authoritarianism in Russia, a radical nationalist anti-Westernism that draws both on old 19th century Slavophile resources and Soviet sources, a revival of Volksgenossen politics, and the Germans should tell you the importance of that, the politics of the 20s and 30s that relied or essentially asserted the existence of national comrades, the need to unite similar languages, common languages in single states. And finally, a willingness to threaten and to wage war to satisfy ambitions, contrary to previous commitments. It's led, among other things, to an attack on Georgia in 2008, continuing serial threats to Georgia, the Ukraine, and the Baltics, and now, of course, to war against Ukraine. To sum up, what the crisis in the Ukraine represents, in my view, is the most recent and perhaps most brutal step in the passage from a world with a lot of hope, some of which was probably unreasonable, to a situation where all our efforts must be aimed at preventing the worst. And on that note, that happy note, I pass the baton to Tom.
Well, thank you, Professor Jacobs. I think it's important to awaken to the ever-looming reality of a more serious war as we approach our topic today, which after all was asked, as you might recall, the question, are we effectively on the brink of a new Cold War, as far as the international implications of the crisis are concerned. Our last speaker is Thomas Hansen, who is a former United States Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, whose diplomatic positions included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He also participated in the opening of new United States embassies in Mongolia and Estonia, worked on the foreign relations committees of the United States Senate and House of Representatives, and served as director for NATO and European Affairs at the Atlantic Council of the United States in Washington, D.C. Mr. Hansen currently serves as diplomat in residence at the Ellsworth Institute for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota Duluth. He's also program secretary of the St. Paul Minneapolis Committee on Foreign Relations and is a member of the Great Decisions Advisory Committee at the Minnesota International Center, where he's a frequent Great Decision speaker. He contributes to local and international media and is a board member of the Oslo Center for Peace and Human Rights, the International Leadership Program at our school, and the Cultural Entrepreneurship Program at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Mr. Hansen holds a BA degree from the University of Minnesota and graduate degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Also the Institute of Advanced International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland, and the National School of Administration in Paris, France. Mr. Hansen will discuss the crisis in the context of United States and Russian relations since the end of the Cold War, in terms of the shifting priorities for the United States foreign policy. He will also speak about NATO's dynamics with respect to Ukraine. Let's welcome Mr. Hansen.
Thank you, Paul, very much, and thank you for organizing this very topical panel discussion. It's really kind of wrenching to discuss this tragic and poignant situation that is unfolding in Ukraine. Here's this country with aspirations that have been described so eloquently by our speakers for a better life, a more democratic life. It's also a country where its western portion, Galicia, has a very different history, including membership in the Habsburg Empire at the end of World War I, from the eastern part, the Donbass. It's a tragically, historically divided country, and we must find a way to keep it together and allow it to integrate for its own benefit. When empires collapse, it is almost always a messy, but more important, drawn-out process. This year is the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. And when we look out at the conflagration that's sweeping the Middle East and the rise of ISIS, we are dealing with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. We're dealing with the artificial boundaries that resulted from the peace that ended World War I. I'm afraid that the process that is underway regarding the collapse of the Soviet Union is beginning to show signs of being messier than it appeared at the beginning. If we look around the periphery of Russia, in Moldova, and of course when Russia collapsed, the Soviet Union turned into 15 republics. In Moldova, we have a separated part of that country, Transnistria, which is frozen in place. It's what they call a frozen conflict that's ongoing. If we look at Armenia and Azerbaijan, we have Nagorno-Karabakh, another frozen conflict in which borders are in question. The Caucasus. In 2008, the Russians invaded, and we have Ossetia and Abkhazia, which were separated from Georgia and are now a frozen conflict. And now suddenly in Ukraine, we have similar dynamics happening, but this time at the core of that former empire. What kind of Vladimir Putin are we dealing with here? It isn't that enigmatic, although if you look at his two most famous quotes, the one we hear most often is that it was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, that the Soviet Union collapsed and is no more. That's what we hear. In Russia, the quote that's more often, and actually in Germany as well, more often quoted is Putin's having said, anyone who has a heart would have to lament the demise of the Soviet Union. No one with a brain would seek to restore it in its previous form. Which Putin is this? I want to take a look at the situation as it's evolving in two areas that I know something about. I defer to our experts on many of the internal Ukrainian dynamics. I want to look at the responses within NATO and differences of view, actually, of what's happening in Ukraine, especially in Germany. This is an issue of great concern to the U.S. government, that our key ally in NATO, Renee alluded to this when she spoke of the older Europeans and the new European countries, the more powerful European countries, having more doubts about integration of Ukraine. Indeed, early in the Crimea crisis, in fact, after the Russians had taken Crimea, all three living former German chancellors, Helmut Schmidt, Helmut Kohl, and Gerhard Schroeder, expressed understanding for Putin on Crimea. The Spiegel magazine at that stage had a cover story, How Western is Germany? Now, there's scant support for Putin's subsequent actions in eastern Ukraine, but these are rumblings out of Germany, which I think bear discussing. The second area I will look at is how this crisis now is impacting U.S. foreign policy. Our debate 13 years after 9/11, 11 years after the wars we've been involved in the Middle East. And here I'll be talking about the rather sharp divide between the liberal liberal neoconservative, because there's a lot of overlap in the views expressed by people of that persuasion, and the realist school, which is a minority view, but is expressing itself among experts and in our journals. The question is, what is the right approach? And really, if you want to kind of distill it, which recent war do you take as your warning paradigm? World War I or World War II? One of the best books about 1914 on the 100th anniversary is titled The Sleepwalkers, about how the European large powers went sleepwalking into major conflict. Is that the kind of situation we're dealing with in Ukraine? Or is it World War II, where we have to stand up to dictatorship and for freedom? Which paradigm do we look at? And to shed some light on these, I'm going to quickly look at what I think is an important element here, and that is the way the Cold War ended and the way this new era we are in now got started. Now, of course, in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed. And Europe and Russia, Soviet Union then, and we were faced with a dilemma. What do we do with this country, which had started 2 world wars in the century, and which everyone had been very comfortable having divided? As they used to say, NATO's goal is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Well, lo and behold, when the wall collapsed, our key allies, Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand of France, bitterly opposed the very concept of unification. Margaret Thatcher said that if Germany unifies, it will eventually look east, as it always has in its history. But we were able, in conjunction with Helmut Kohl and the German government at the time, to convince our allies and to convince Gorbachev and his Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, that not only should Germany unite, but that it should be allowed to join NATO. Not a foregone conclusion. A very peaceful and elegant end to this war. By the way we got the French on board was the euro. The euro is a direct result of 1989. It's what we had to promise, and the Germans had to promise the French to get them on board. Now, there's a lot of discussion now. What was promised to the Russians when we allowed Germany to unite? There are articles being read about this. Gorbachev insists that we promised we would not take advantage. Primarily, we would not expand NATO. Brent Scowcroft probably has the clearest explanation of this. He was the first President Bush's foreign policy advisor. He has written, what we promised the Russians was that we would not station NATO troops in the East German part of united Germany. Subsequently, the Russians said we wouldn't station NATO anywhere east. Well, in my recollection is that applied only to Germany. And here's a key statement. Because we had no notion of expanding NATO at that time, that wasn't on the horizon, it wasn't even on the agenda. Now, the first Bush was I would say, a more realist president. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, our policy was to be inclusive of Russia, to include it in something called Partnership for Peace, not to expand NATO, but rather to treat Russia on an equal basis. Now, a significant change took place under President Bill Clinton in 1994, when a more liberal idea really came to the fore. By this time, we were really gearing up for democracy promotion with the end of the Cold War. Institutions like the National Endowment of Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, a vast set of NGOs helping countries to become civil societies and more democratic was getting underway. And in that context, we announced that we would expand NATO. George Kennan at the time, the famous diplomat, author of the Containment document, in his view, it was the greatest mistake since World War II of American foreign policy. He predicted that we would face a revanchist Russia within 20 years. This was in 1994, he made this prediction. But as it was, Russia accepted this grudgingly, very grudgingly, and expansion went forward through the 90s in several phases, as has been described here. When Vladimir Putin came in 2000, he basically accepted this and accepted also the further expansion into the Baltic states. He'd been in power for 4 years when NATO expanded to the Baltic states. But by 2006, the Russians began to signal that expansion further into Georgia and Ukraine would be perceived as a threat to Russian national interests. And the question was, how should we have responded to those signals? I think there was a strong consensus in Washington. I'd say there's still a strong consensus between our two major parties that democracy and freedom are more important, and that our foreign policy should be geared toward the promotion of democracy in countries like Ukraine. Of course, things became confused then in 2008, and briefly on Georgia. We know about the invasion that the Russians carried out of Georgia in 2008. Almost as important, in the months before, the Germans vetoed the idea of NATO expansion to Ukraine and Georgia. And here we see a fissure potentially developing between our closest and most important ally in NATO and U.S. policy at the time. The idea was that we had pushed Russia far enough, and we had now to reconsider. But after 2008, President Obama came in, and the whole issue of NATO expansion into Georgia and Ukraine was put on the back burner. We reset our relations with Russia, engaged in more negotiating. This is with Putin. But the issue was left ambiguous. In theory, NATO expansion into Georgia, Ukraine was still theoretically on the agenda. And this is what then led to the confusion around the EU program to expand its association agreement into Ukraine. For the Russians, it was very unclear exactly how NATO expansion and the EU fit together. In the past, usually the two have gone somewhat in tandem. And I think this is where some people feel there was some sleepwalking going on in the way the EU approached these negotiations with Ukraine. As Henry Kissinger has written, the European Union must recognize that its bureaucratic dilatoriness and subordination of strategic thinking to domestic politics in negotiating Ukraine's relationship to Europe turned a negotiation into a crisis. This is the realist point of view now. And I'm explaining here the divisions within our foreign policy establishment. Liberals would not, I don't think, take that as the reason this all happened. You know, the realist position, and there's an article in Foreign Affairs magazine this month by John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, who's one of the most prominent realist thinkers, titled Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault. He basically says in a very concise way, this is geopolitics 101, he says. Great powers are always sensitive to potential threats near their home territory. And there are a number of former diplomats. Our former ambassador to Russia, Jack Matlock, has been writing along these lines that NATO expansion was at the heart of this. And Henry Kissinger and others, including Zbigniew Brzezinski, are calling for an agreement over the status of Ukraine that would be something like the Austria Treaty of 1955, that would guarantee that Ukraine could trade between East and West, but that would create a new buffer state in these, as was described, bloodlands. This, as I say, is the realist position. Now, the liberal democracy promotion position, of course, disagrees fundamentally with this. A former Foreign Service colleague who used to work with Jack Matlock, in response to Matlock's views, kind of realist views, wrote the following. He said, "Are the fears of an autocratic ruler, i.e. Putin, sitting in the Kremlin now more important than the hopes of the people of Warsaw or Tallinn or Kiev?" And of course, that's the whole wrenching trade-off. As we, all through history, larger powers have made deals over the head of countries like Poland and others in the bloodlands of Central Europe. Should this pattern continue? Even if it does stabilize the region, isn't morally correct. Now, what are Putin's goals? Well, looking at it, I think what he wants at a minimum is a cordon sanitaire in Ukraine, a buffer state. I think he wants to keep Ukraine intact. When you think about it, the best way to keep Ukraine out of NATO is to keep the Donbass, the east, in Ukraine. If they do separate out the east, the rest of Ukraine would quickly join NATO. I think he wants elected governors in the east so that there's some handle on things. I think ideally he'd like something like the 1955 Austrian treaty. But Putin has painted himself into a corner. I think he underestimated the Germans, that they would go along with sanctions. I think he underestimated Poroshenko as well. I think he saw a fellow oligarch at first and was surprised. So it could escalate out of control. It very well could, depending on events. Will the Russians at some point try to seize all of what they call Novorossiya, as was pointed out here, along the coast to assure the connection to Crimea, maybe as far as Odessa? Who knows? I think the Russians are dealing from a position of weakness ultimately and would think twice before doing this, but it is a situation that could spiral out of control. Now, where are we now? Well, of course, there are going to be elections to the Verkhovna Rada Parliament on October 26. Poroshenko will likely be reelected. There are many shifts going on as winter approaches. The sanctions are biting on all sides. The economy minister of Russia, Mr. Ulkanov, said just yesterday that the high inflation and low growth in Russia could be eventually creating an explosive situation in Russia. The head of Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, and a former energy minister warned this week that Russia could end up collapsing like the Soviet Union. Now, they've got about 8% inflation, zero growth. Capital flight is speeding up. This is a problem for Russia. But I think Putin's idea is the Russians can outsuffer the West. Germany is showing signs now, a 6% decline in GDP in August. This is a troubling sign. Is it linked to Ukraine? And of course, Ukraine itself is facing a very severe winter. It doesn't have the resources from the metallurgical sector in the east. It's not getting a lot of economic help from the European Union. And obviously oil is an issue. So on all sides, things are difficult. Actors are shifting. There are new governments now in the two countries that really have been the big ones pushing a sort of a more tougher policy toward Russia. Poland has a new government. Foreign Minister Sikorski is gone, and the new government is sounding much more Poland first, Ukraine fend for itself. This is a major shift. And Sweden, which has been a strong supporter, now has a social democratic government, which may or may not be as strong. There's a new Secretary General of NATO as well, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who's been a very strong figure, has been replaced by Jens Stoltenberg. I know Jens. I'm not convinced he'll be quite as strong on some of these issues. So what is likely to happen? In conclusion, I think for Ukraine, it must be rather a sobering moment now. It's clear that Russia is not going to give up, that they're willing to go quite far militarily to prevent a consolidation in Ukraine. In a sense, they want this more than we do. They see this as of greater strategic interest than does the West. Very unfortunately, at least that's what the facts seem to be. Look at the NATO summit in Wales. President Poroshenko went there saying we need bombs and not blankets, but they basically got blankets. There's no lethal military support going to Ukraine. And in fact, the Wales summit spent more time on the Baltic states and what they call a new spearhead policy of rotating troops for the existing members of NATO than they did actually for Ukraine. So this must be very, I would think, sobering. I spoke with a young student, a Ukrainian student whom I had in class last year. We Skyped to his dorm room in Kiev, and he said, they've just told us that we've got to now go to school on Saturdays and maybe Sundays because we're going to close the university in November to save energy. They're battening down the hatches in Ukraine to get through this. So if it's clear NATO's not going to get involved militarily, we're not willing to provide lethal arms, what should we do? Sanctions? Should we just let them wear everyone down and hope that Russia budges at some point? Will the Germans budge first? And if we really decide that we've got to resolve the situation in a balance of power way, would it be feasible to make Ukraine a buffer state between East and West so they could trade equally with both but not join NATO? Maybe, but that is not where the U.S. is. The liberal consensus in Washington is strong in both parties, and that is for promoting democracy. As our Deputy Secretary of State said in a recent conversation, we're not going to make deals over the heads of the Ukrainians. So I'll stop there. That's the landscape as I see it at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Henson. Well, it's very clear that joining NATO may not be a solution after all, despite the fact that Ukraine wants the joining of NATO so much. Now, this would be a moment at which we will collect your comments and questions, and if I could ask my assistant, Erica, if you could raise your hand if you wanted to pass on those comments to Erica. And so as she is collecting your comments, what I would ask to do is I would, at this point, would ask our panelists to comment very, very briefly on perhaps each other's presentations, if they so desire, whilst we are collecting the comments and questions. Would anybody else like to start?
Well, I don't have a comment so much as
Steve.
Is that on? Yeah. I don't have a comment so much as a question for Tom and anyone else. What you mentioned briefly the energy side of the equation and any review of maps looking at the dependency of Europe on Russian gas in particular, given the winter. it's some remarkable numbers, the degree of dependency. I'm wondering if you could just comment on how much you think that is in fact going to drive the circumstances over the next winter.
I think this is, yes. I mean, it's going to be obviously a major factor. You know, the Russians and the Ukrainians have signed a gas deal. So theoretically, there's a deal in place which ought to help, but obviously the Russians can revoke that at any moment. And given the fact that there's still fighting going on, especially around the Donetsk airport, you know, if you look at the struggling that's still going on, it's almost as if they're trying to find exactly what the green line is going to be. These are like the last adjustments to what could become for a while a kind of a green line of a frozen conflict. So I think we're seeing the sort of the cleaning up, if you will, and it's kind of a tragic phrase to use. You know, Ukraine is dependent. Russia is squeezing countries that used to transport as a third party into Ukraine. So it's not just Ukraine that's being squeezed, and of course the West Europeans. We have this big shale boom going on in the U.S., and the question arises, couldn't we export some of our new resources to help Europe? And my understanding is that that's not in the cards for a long time to come. What we can do, though, is maybe bring the world oil price down, which is already happening, which does put a squeeze somewhat on Russia, but that's a long-term factor.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions, perhaps? Professor Jacobs?
Of comments. I want to emphasize a point that Tom made, which is that we are still dealing, both in Central Europe and in the Middle East, with the consequences of 1917, 1918, 1919, 1920. Those things have not gone away. The collapse of those empires, more or less simultaneously, left us with a host of what appeared, at least from a realist perspective, to be problems that cannot be solved, at least to satisfaction, to mutual satisfaction. The second thing, and this is, I think, something of a humorous observation, when the wall came down in 1989, 1990, the problem that was at the top of everyone's agenda was the German problem. We had, despite all the rhetoric to the contrary, solved the German problem. The Cold War solved it. And then here it had returned. It would seem, more than a couple of decades on, that we have it yet again, but in a significantly different form.
Professor Burr?
So one thing that also comes to mind talking about energy dependency that might be worth keeping an eye out for, I believe a couple of weeks ago, Hungary had been exporting some of their share of oil into Ukraine to sort of relieve some of that pressure. And what we found was that the Hungarian government was essentially pressured diplomatically to cease those shipments. And I believe it's implied under threat that Russia would cut off their supplies in the winter. So one of those things to keep an eye out for is that whole idea of war continued by other means. So if Putin decides he doesn't really want to engage in a hot conflict in Ukraine, one way that he could squeeze them pretty effectively is just to scare all of their neighbors who have been supporting them with energy imports. So definitely something to keep an eye out for as a diplomatic measure that could be very effective for Putin.
Erica, could I have at least some questions from the audience? Thank you.
There are also general questions. Do you believe that Putin will stop at Ukraine? And doesn't it seem to be reminiscent of the Soviet Union? And if he succeeds, will he in fact stop? Perhaps just short replicas on that front? And
that was going to be one of the questions I had for my fellow panelists, is whether there is an expectation that, or rather, is the Russian government, is Putin operating on the basis of a grand strategy, a grand vision, or is it all about improvisation and his next move depends on his last move? That if he's successful in this effort, he'll move forward with another effort. But I think there is that question whether there is a grand strategy at work, and there's great disagreement on that, I believe.
As I say, which Putin are we dealing with? I tend toward the improvisational Putin in some ways. I think that they've been clear since 2008 that they were not going to allow a change in status of Ukraine and Georgia. That's clear. And to that extent, it's a long-term policy. But Russia, if you look closely, is very weak, demographically especially. You know, their population is collapsing. Very few children were born in the 90s, and those women are coming of age now. It's a very small cohort to have children at this point. And Putin's very aware of this demographic weakness. A portrait on the wall of Foreign Minister Lavrov, the foreign minister, hangs a portrait of Prince Gorbachev, who was foreign minister of old Russia after the Crimean War, which was a period of great weakness for Russia. And he is seen by the current government as having dealt from a position of weakness very astutely to reestablish Russia's strength by the end of the century. And I think that is Putin's view. I think he's enough of a realist to know that I don't think they can go sallying in certainly the Baltic states or Poland. Now, whether they take more of eastern Ukraine if the crisis escalates, that can't be ruled out.
would anybody else like to weigh in specifically on this question?
Historical note, the question raised by Professor Hoffman is one that is applicable in a wide variety of historical circumstances. When you have an aggressive state, one form or another, the question very quickly arises whether its government is acting to some preconceived design or whether it's improvisational. And I think we could, in 10 minutes, identify a huge number of historiographical issues that revolve around that question. It's a classic one.
Mm-hmm. So there's a very quick follow-up question here, actually. Is there a difference in this regard between the Soviet leaders and Putin? And if so, what difference?
We're in a situation different from the Cold War with Russia. This is not a global struggle. Russia, if anything, is, I think, emerging as a strong regional power. I think that if our intelligence agencies now are telling us that we've entered a multipolar world, it's because there are these regional powers rising. I think China, a strong regional power in Asia, perhaps Iran, and we have to figure out how to deal with these powers. There's no all-embracing ideological struggle as well. I see in here maybe it is correct to say that Putin is more of a 19th century figure in a way, looking at Russia and Russia's position geopolitically. I think he's aware that the Soviet Union is in the past.
I've just started a book by Zimmerman called Ruling Russia, starting with the last of the czars, running through Lenin and then through the USSR and now up to Putin. And I believe he would argue that there is great continuity, that the methods and the worldviews, historic methods have a tremendous influence on Putin and his sense of great power conflict, whether he wants to be a regional hegemon or actually engage in much more extended conflict reminiscent of the Cold War. I think there's, at least Zimmerman would argue that the continuity is very, very strong from empire of the Tsars to the empire of the Soviet Union, and perhaps not empire to Putin, but at least some sense of his place in that lineage.
Thank you. Professor Burr?
The first thing I always preface any response on something like this is I've been conditioned by the government to say that it's impossible to divine motivations and intentions. So it tends to be my knee-jerk reaction. The thing that puzzled me most about Putin's behavior, which I felt to me seemed very out of what I expected of his character. I was in no way surprised at the annexation of Crimea. If nothing else, he was just sick of paying rent on it. So in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, it makes sense. Right? You wouldn't even need the historical justifications or anything like that. It's something that Putin has instrumental reasons for wanting control of. I'm far more puzzled by the broader encouragement of conflict in East Ukraine. To me, that doesn't make much sense from a strategic standpoint and from a realist standpoint. And that is where I start to wonder if he has sort of ideologically gone off a deep end that at the time I was in the US government, we assumed he was entirely not an ideologue and entirely a realist. So that was the one thing that really threw me for a loop, that it didn't seem strategically or from a cost-benefit analysis standpoint to really make a lot of sense with his other behaviors. Keeping it as a buffer zone, absolutely. But do you want to actually have an active conflict in that buffer zone? It doesn't make much sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Professor Jacobs?
One small note to add to this question, and that is historians sort of struggled to deal with the question to which the Soviet Union was somehow a continuation of Imperial Russia. There was a subset of questions that simply asked, well, is the Soviet Union a conservative power or a revolutionary one? And the combination of the two, the continuity issue, the conservative versus revolutionary, wound many commentators round the axle endlessly.
Thank you. Well, we have about 10 minutes, and so what I would ask is our panelists to choose one question out of the set that they've been distributed and to comment on that. Please read the question first and then comment, of course, on the question. Perhaps we could start with Professor Hoffman.
I think the question I would choose to answer is behind door number one. Could you please identify the indigenous people of the Crimea? Not being a cultural geographer, I would say that whatever answer I give is probably not the best informed. But I think when people think about that question, they think about the Tartars as at least the largest ethnic minority in the area. The absorption of Crimea by Russia created a lot of commentary, not just on their present status, but also on their expulsion by Stalin earlier in earlier in the history of the Soviet Union, and their return. And the question arises as to what role they are going to play in Crimea going forward, whether they'll be a source of instability, whether they will find a way to accommodate themselves to the new reality. I think when one thinks about indigenous people, that would probably be the ethnic on top of the list.
Thank you. Professor Burr?
Let's see, yeah. So one of the questions that I received was, what are the consequences of a poor national identity? Since that's something Dr. Hoffman and I find near and dear to our hearts, I'll comment a little bit on that. honestly, I could go on for hours, and so I will refrain from doing so. And really just say that, I can, yes. In Ukraine in particular, the lack of a coherent national identity is, I think, something that can be manipulated by outside actors to keep the country divided. What I've found at conferences where people have talked with people, Ukrainians in the East, in the West, is that there is a real attempt to be Ukrainian first and then worry about what it means to be Ukrainian second. And that's actually probably a very positive development for a country that we think of as so divided. But it's really to the advantage of the great powers on either side to try to push them to pick one side or another. And as we found in Belarus, sometimes the national identity is ambiguous, and nonetheless, that is part of that national identity. But it makes the population, the government, I think, susceptible to being pulled in multiple directions by more powerful states. So I would say in Ukraine, that is probably the biggest complication as a result of the lack of a cohesive national identity.
Thank you. Professor Jacobs?
The question to which I would like to respond is as follows. Can you explain Russia's seemingly moderate support of pro-Russian rebels, going so far as to directly intervene in the crisis, yet withholding the full strength of the Russian army? It seems that as if they don't want to, quote-unquote, win, but are just encouraging conflict. I think there are 2 or 3 reasonable explanations for the form that Putin's intervention has taken. The first is, I think he overestimated the popular support for a Russian agenda, even in the eastern zone.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a guess, but I think that is relevant. I think also that he underestimated the ability of the Kiev authorities to organize themselves. Admittedly, it is a chaotic effort and weak in many respects, but I think it was, in the end, more effective than Putin expected. Again, that's a guess. A more concrete point is that the Russian army, Russian ground forces, are very much like other modern ground forces in that the proportion of the force that is operationally ready is quite small relative to the total establishment embodied in reserves and the like. To invade Ukraine on a large scale would, if I have the numbers correct, would have required the withdrawal of forces from such interesting places as Chechnya. And you don't have to dwell too long on that particular problem to see why the Russian army, ground forces, were employed in this limited fashion. And then finally, I think that Putin, again, this is a guess, taking into account your very wise observation about the dangers of estimating intentions. I do think that Putin wanted to avoid acting on a scale that would have led automatically to the use of the term war, because of all the consequences that flow from the general recognition, the general use of that term applied to this conflict. And when you look back over the public pronouncements of authorities, what you see is that there's a lot of very spirited dancing to avoid the use of the term war. Not the least by Poroshenko himself, for I think quite good reasons. It's constantly referred to as an anti-terrorist operation. So for those 4 reasons, overestimating, underestimating the sort of concrete problem of the size and strength of forces ready for operations, and then finally, I think for quite reasonable diplomatic purposes, trying to avoid the general recognition of a state of war.
Thank you. Mr. Hansen?
The question that I've chosen here is, does the crisis in Ukraine pose a serious threat to U.S. security? And what type of involvement should the U.S. have? Well, there are a lot of aspects to this question, and it is kind of a basic question. The fact that we are not contemplating any military involvement would indicate that it's not a serious threat to our security. We'd be treating it in a different way. If we look at how we're treating ISIS, we clearly see that as a more serious threat. But it does impact our interests, and long-term it impacts our security. There's no question about that. We need Russia in a number of ways. We're about to pull troops out of Afghanistan. Up until now, the Russians are cooperating with us in allowing us to use exit areas that they control. And we'd be in a bit of a pickle if the relations deteriorated to the point where they cut that off. They're working with us on Iran in trying to stop the Iranian nuclear program. We have a strong interest in not allowing nuclear proliferation. We've had programs with Russia to try to prevent nuclear proliferation from Russia. So in all these areas, our interests are at stake. Now, the initial reaction of NATO has been to strengthen the resolve of our allies. They're talking about really maybe meeting the 2% of GDP goals. I'll believe it when I see it, but the Wales summit really did seem to sort of strengthen the alliance. But the third area where Russia is reacting is in turning toward China. Now, as they do that, they're the junior partner. As they turn toward Eurasia, and I thought it was very well outlined, the Eurasianist aspect by Stephen. They're the junior partner. And yet they are, in terms of energy, in terms of trying to turn the BRICS organization, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa, the fifth BRIC. It's a good trivia question. Now 5 BRICS. You know, they're coming up with some institutions parallel to those of the IMF and World Bank. Russia and China now are talking about not using the dollar in their trade. I mean, to the extent that we alienate both China and Russia simultaneously, and our pivot is having some effect that way, this could long-term affect our interests. It's not there yet, but as you start to see alliance structures forming, if you look at Russia and China and potentially Pakistan, because China has a very close relationship with Pakistan right now, and on our side, India, although India is neutralist, but we're hoping to draw India in with our allies in Asia. I mean, I hate to think of new power alliances starting to form. It's not there yet. This is all embryonic, but a crisis like this in Ukraine could speed up some of these developments. In that way, we'd be turning back toward a world more like 1914.
Well, thank you. This would be a fitting point to bring our panel to conclusion. Let me make a quick announcement that on Friday there will be a symposium on international law, sovereignty, and Ukraine, its legal and political implications, and that's at the University of St. Thomas's Law School, and you can follow the details of that announcement. I should only mention the fact also that 2 of our panelists, Professor Hoffman and Professor Burr, will also be speakers at that symposium. Now, you've asked some wonderful questions. We have certainly not exhausted all of them, so feel free to stay after this event to raise those questions in a personal manner to the speakers. And on this note, let us also thank the speakers for their participation.